An alarm just went off. You silence it. You drag yourself out of bed. There's a commute waiting, a Slack channel already lighting up, a calendar that's somehow already full before 9 a.m. You tell yourself this is just what being a person means. This is the job. This is life. But here's the thing nobody tells you. For 95% of the time humans have existed on Earth, none of that was true. No alarms, no bosses, no 8-hour shifts. And the strangest part isn't that ancient life was harder than yours. In a lot of ways, it wasn't. It might have been easier. And the evidence for that is genuinely wild.
Let's go back, way back. Not to factories, not to farms, all the way back to small bands of hunter-gatherers moving across open land with no fixed address and no 5-year plan. For most people, the mental image here is brutal. Constant danger, constant hunger, a miserable scramble to survive until you die at 30. That picture is mostly wrong. And we know it's wrong because someone actually went and checked.
In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee traveled to the Kalahari Desert in Botswana to study a hunter-gatherer people called the Jew/Hawansi. His plan was simple: follow them around, write down everything they did, add up the hours. He expected to find a population working themselves into the ground just to eat. What he found instead was almost embarrassing for the modern world. Adults spent around 15 to 20 hours a week obtaining food, total, for the whole week. Sit with that number for a second. Your job alone is 40 hours. That's before your commute, before laundry, before you answer one more email at 10 p.m. because you forgot earlier. Lee's data said the so-called primitive humans were working less than half of what you do, just to stay alive in an actual desert.
Why? No rent, no retirement account, no emergency fund for some hypothetical future disaster. If the environment gave you enough with 15 hours of effort, you stopped at 15 hours. Nobody was chasing a promotion. There was no next tier to unlock. This is where it gets philosophically annoying, in a good way. In 1968, an economist named Marshall Sahlins published an essay with one of the great troll titles in academic history. He called it the original Affluent Society. His argument? Affluence isn't about having a lot. It's about the gap between what you want and what you've got. You can close that gap by producing more, which is the entire modern economy in one sentence. Or you can close it by wanting less. Hunter-gatherers, Sahlins said, were often rich. Not because they had more stuff, because they didn't want more stuff in the first place.
Let that sink in. Your ancestors weren't poor by their own standards. They're only poor by a standard invented thousands of years later, built specifically to make you feel like your life is incomplete unless you buy the next thing. Remove that machine, and the bar for enough drops fast. So what did they do with all that spare time? This is where the story gets genuinely strange. They rested. A lot. They talked. They told stories for hours. An anthropologist named Polly Wiesner went back decades after Lee and specifically studied conversations around the fire. Daytime talk, she found, was mostly logistics. Complaints, gossip, who's doing what. Nighttime talk, once the fire was lit, shifted hard toward myth, history, legend. Wiesner's theory? Firelight itself created a window the daylight never could. A space with no task attached.
Think about that. The campfire wasn't just heat. It was infrastructure for culture. A nightly slot where nobody was working, nobody was foraging, and the whole group just existed together, passing down identity through voice and flame. When's the last time you did that? Not scrolling, not half watching something while your phone sits in your other hand. Actually just sitting there with people doing nothing useful on purpose. Here's the twist that makes this whole thing stranger than a nice campfire story. If hunter-gatherers had it this good, why did anyone ever leave? The honest answer: farming didn't make life easier. For a long time, it made it worse. Around 12,000 years ago, humans started domesticating crops, and skeletons from early farming populations tell a brutal story. Shorter people, worse teeth, more joint damage from repetitive labor. Farming produced more total food, but it also produced more total people, and more people ate up the surplus faster than the surplus could free anyone's time. This is sometimes called the agricultural trap, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Once your population grows around farming, there's no clean way back. You can't uninvent the extra mouths to feed.
And once that trap closed, everything else followed. Surplus, property, hierarchy. Eventually, thousands of years later, jobs in the modern sense, where you sell hours of your own time to someone else instead of just gathering what you need yourself. The 8-hour workday you live inside, by the way, is not ancient at all. It's a product of labor fights from the late 1800s and early 1900s, younger than some family trees, fought for by workers pushing back against factory days that were even longer. The structure you assume is just how life works is a recent patch sitting on top of agriculture, which is also recent on a human timescale, sitting on top of nearly 200,000 years of something that looked a lot more like 15-hour work weeks and long firelit evenings.
This is where it gets personal, because your nervous system never got the memo that any of this changed. You evolved expecting effort that pays off fast. Hunt, eat. Gather, eat. Short loop, clear reward. Now look at a normal workday. You answer an email that creates 3 more emails. You sit in a meeting that produces another meeting. The effort is constant. The payoff is abstract, delayed, sometimes invisible for months. No ancestor of yours built a stress response for that. The same system that once fired for a stalking predator now fires for a notification sound, and it genuinely cannot tell the difference between a lion and your inbox.
There's also a piece of this most people never think to ask about: childhood. Your kid's day is blocks: school block, homework block, activity block, screen block, bed, all separated from adult life, all supervised, all scheduled. That's not ancient either. Anthropologists studying groups like the Hadza in Tanzania have documented something almost unrecognizable by comparison. Kids weren't shipped off to a separate institution for the day. They were just there, embedded in whatever the adults were doing, learning by watching and copying, and being handed small, real tasks long before they could actually do them well. A toddler near a fire learns what fire does by being near it, not from a worksheet. There's no test on Friday, there's no falling behind, because there's no external clock to fall behind from. Even stranger, these kids often had way more independence than modern parenting norms would ever allow. Wandering camp, playing with peers, exploring nearby terrain with way less direct adult supervision than you'd expect. Not because anyone was careless, because the whole camp was the supervision. A dozen adults, a handful of older kids, all loosely watching, all available. You needed a village because you actually had one. A modern parent is often alone in a house for hours, fully responsible for one kid's entire safety and entertainment, with zero backup absorbing any of that load. The job didn't get harder because parents got worse at it. The job got harder because almost all the old infrastructure quietly disappeared. Now, here's the uncomfortable part of the story. The part that explains why modern attempts to fix this keep failing. You cannot schedule your way back into the old rhythm, because the old rhythm wasn't a schedule. It was the default setting, occasionally interrupted by effort. Your life runs the opposite script. Work is the default. Rest is the thing you have to earn, then justify, then usually feel a little guilty about anyway. A weekend is not the same thing as 15 genuinely unstructured hours spread naturally through every single day. A vacation you have to book a year in advance is not the same thing as a fire that just happens automatically every night with zero planning required. There's one more myth worth killing here. And it's about tools. The popular image of early humans is basically a guy with a rock, banging two rocks together, badly, for his entire life. That's not what the archaeology shows. Tool-making among hunter-gatherers was specialized, skilled, and often took years to master. An anthropologist studying the Hadza, a hunting and gathering group in Tanzania, found that the most successful hunters in the group weren't the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones with the deepest accumulated knowledge of animal behavior, tracking patterns, and seasonal cycles, knowledge that took literally decades to build. This wasn't brute survival, it was expertise. Real, deep, hard-won expertise. The same category of skill you'd associate with a surgeon or a pilot, just pointed at a completely different problem.
And the tools themselves weren't crude either, once you actually look closely. Stone points from sites tens of thousands of years old show consistent, repeated technique. Same angle, same pressure, same flaking pattern over and over, passed down with enough precision that archaeologists can identify which regional tradition a tool came from just by its shape, the same way you might recognize a brand by its logo. That's not improvisation. That's a transmitted body of knowledge, refined generation after generation. Exactly the same process that gives you a smartphone today, just running at a much slower clock speed.
Here's a thought experiment to make all of this land. Picture your actual week. Monday through Friday, work. Weekend, errands, maybe some forced relaxation you have to consciously schedule in. Now picture a Juhawansi week. A few mornings hunting or gathering, a few mornings on tools or repairs or camp tasks, and then, repeatedly, blocks of time with absolutely nothing required of you at all. Not nothing as in boredom, nothing as in freedom. Time to visit a neighboring camp, time to teach a kid to track, time to just lie in the shade and talk until somebody falls asleep mid-sentence. If you tried to build that schedule today, you'd need to be either independently wealthy or extremely committed to disappointing your boss. For them, it was just Tuesday.
There's also a quieter irony buried in all of this, and it's about how modern people try to fix the problem once they notice it. You can't really meditate your way out of a structural mismatch. An app reminding you to breathe for 90 seconds between meetings is not the same thing as an evening that was never scheduled to begin with. A retreat you fly to once a year is not the same thing as rest being the default 7 days a week. None of these tools are bad. They're just patches, stitched onto a system that manufactures the exact deficit they're trying to treat. You're not broken for needing a meditation app. You're responding rationally to an environment that nobody actually designed around what a human nervous system evolved to expect.
And maybe that's the most useful reframe in this entire story. The exhaustion isn't a personal failing. It's not a sign you're bad at managing your time, or weak, or somehow doing modern life wrong while everyone else figures it out. It's closer to running brand new software on million-year-old hardware and being mildly surprised when the fans start spinning at full speed by Wednesday afternoon. Your ancestors weren't built differently than you. They just lived inside a system that asked less of them and gave them more space to simply exist without earning it first. None of this means hunter-gatherer life was paradise. It wasn't. Higher infant mortality, less protection from disease and weather and predators, shorter average lifespans, although that number is more complicated than it sounds, mostly dragged down by childhood deaths rather than every single adult dying young. This isn't an argument to abandon modern medicine or go live in a forest. It's narrower than that. It's separating two ideas that got glued together without your permission. Modern life is safer. That one's true. Modern life is how humans are supposed to spend their time. That one's a lot shakier than you've been told. So why does the ancient life was brutal story feel so obviously true, even when the data complicates it? Partly survivorship bias. The skeletons and sites we find most easily often come from populations under stress, because stress leaves more visible damage behind. Comfortable, well-fed groups leave fewer dramatic clues. And partly, honestly,
ego. If modern life is the hardest version of human existence that's ever existed, your exhaustion becomes proof of progress instead of a problem worth questioning. That's a much more comfortable story than the alternative. That you're tired not because life has always been this demanding, but because something about the structure itself doesn't fit what a human actually needs.
So what do you actually do with any of this? You're not quitting your job and walking into the woods tonight. That's not the takeaway. And honestly, it's not even what the research is pointing at. The Zhuowansi didn't have more leisure because they had smaller ambitions. They had more leisure because their definition of enough was calibrated completely differently, and because rest wasn't treated as something you earn after enough productivity. It was the default state, interrupted only when something specific demanded otherwise. Notice, just for one evening, how fast every gap in your day gets filled the second it appears. Phone fills it, screen fills it, a low hum of "I should be doing something" fills it. The fire didn't get filled like that. It was protected. You don't need an actual campfire to copy that. You need to notice how rare, unguarded, unfilled time has become in your life, and how recent that scarcity actually is. It is not a permanent feature of being human. It's a side effect of an economic structure roughly 200 years old, sitting on an agricultural structure 12,000 years old, sitting on nearly 200,000 years where the human default looked a lot more like a short workday, and the rest of it, genuinely, completely yours.
That alarm is still going to go off tomorrow. You're still going to silence it and start a day that doesn't fully feel like yours. But maybe it lands a little differently now, knowing the exhaustion isn't the ancient default. Knowing that somewhere underneath the meetings and the inbox and the calendar invites, there's an older version of you that expected something else completely. A version that finished the necessary work by midday and spent the evening exactly where it mattered, by the fire, with people, with absolutely nothing left to prove.